part of the reasons you didn't test the samples that you're describing.
Yes.
Okay, next item that you did not test?
Item 296,
Okay, and how was that described to you?
again, that was Bronco driver's door interior.
And did that fall into the same category as the other Bronco items?
Yes.
And same reasons you did not test that as you did not test the other Bronco items?
Overruled.
Yes.
Next item you did not test?
The last one is the item number 81, which was the shirt of Ronald Goldman himself, or the shirt itself.
Okay, now you did not test the shirt.
That's correct.
Okay, but were cuttings provided to you?
Yes, cuttings were provided to me that had been made by the LAPD, and those were the items from the shirt that I tested.
Okay. Okay, we've discussed and defined your role as the lead analyst, but before you actually performed any analyses in this case, you received items of evidence, such as items of clothing or the nail kits that had to be processed. Is that true?
Yes, in other words, before we can do our DNA analysis, we have to look at the evidence and document the evidence and do that sort of processing before we can actually extract the DNA and test it.
Could you describe a typical, I think we picked August 18th, as a representative day for how you processed a series of items in this case? Could you describe you've logged them in and now you get around to processing it. Why don't you describe that to the jury?
Okay. Excuse me, this was fairly early on in the case when we first started looking at the evidentiary items. And I'm just going to go through my lab notes as to the process because
Yes, what page are you referring to, Mr.
yes,
Sims?
this would be page 5 of my notes.
August 18th? Is that the date?
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor.
Proceed.
Okay, why don't you describe the events of August 18th, if that's a typical representative day?
Okay.
Only object to the phrase representative day describes August 18th.
Overruled. Proceed.
The work on this case began around 1:30. This was at a time when Dr. Blake was present to view the sampling, the initial opening of these various items.
Is that the same Dr. Blake that's taught courses with me at your lab?
Yes,
Same one you collaborated with on some of the presentations you've described?
yes.
What sort of an arrangement did you have with him to allow him to be there on August 18th?
Dr. Blake was given full access to view everything we basically did on this case. He had an open invitation to see anything we did, and as it turned out, what he usually did was to view the actual opening of the items and document what was there, and then he would also come by and review our results.
Okay, and how would you let him know something was going to happen?
By telephone.
And he lives nearby?
Yes, he lives in Oakland, and he works in Richmond.
And what was his, he was not just a disinterested bystander in this case, is that true?
Sustained.
Whose interest was he there to represent?
Sustained.
Why
Let's
was
move
he
on.
there?
Let's move on.
He's not always there, is he?
No. It just seemed that way.
Seemed that way, yeah. Now, what did you do on the 18th? What kinds of things did you process?
We processed 2 of the blood stains in this case. It began by removing the evidence from a locked box that we have inside our vault freezer. So we would get the evidence out. I would show the contents of the items to Dr. Blake. He would take photographs to document them, and I had already photographed them, and that's why you saw all those board photographs. I had already done that when the actual date of receipt. Typically, and I'll start here with our item number 6, which is the 48 Bundy drop. No, I'm sorry. I will start with item number 6 from Rockingham. That was the first item looked at this date. The LAPD item number is 6. Make sure I get that right. So what I would do is I would, after the outside of the envelope had been photographed as far as documentation and sealing by Dr. Blake, then I would open up the envelope and lay out the evidence in a particular part of the laboratory to do the examination. I would make notes about what was present, what all the writing was that was on all the bindles and all the coin envelopes. I would initial now the bindles because the bindles are inside the coin envelope. So I'd already initialed the coin envelope when I received it, but now that I took out the bindle, I would write on the bindle. Then inside this bindle would be a stained swatch. We've heard a lot of discussion about what a swatch is, so I won't go into that. But then I would photograph and document what was present as far as the swatches. So I would make measurements, as I mentioned earlier.
How would you make those measurements?
Just take a ruler, hold it close to it, and see how many millimeters it is.
Why don't you just flatten it out and press it right up against the ruler?
Well, I don't really want the ruler to come into contact with the swatch.
Why not?
Well, I don't want to take any chance on contaminating it in that fashion.
So how good are your measurements on these sizes then?
Well, they're actually pretty close because I could hold a pair of forceps up to the ruler. And in fact, between items, I would actually bleach the ruler. So it got pretty clean that way.
Now, do you actually note all the identifying marks and writing on the bindles as you observe them?
Yes, I do.
And they're written in your notes?
They are actually written in my notes as to what it would say on that. So for example, on this bindle, there were the initials CY, G, and then the number G8880 to DOJ 81194. On the back of the bindle, the item number, well, not item number, just the number 6, the numeral 6, and what appeared to me the initials DF.
And you actually describe what the swatches look like?
Yes, I would describe them in terms of how well stained they appeared, what their measurements were, how many there were, certainly, that sort of thing.
Okay, and later on, when you got substrate controls, did you actually describe how they appeared to you?
Yes, I did.
Okay, why don't you take it up and talk again about 6 and 48, the processing of those.
Yes, this is still on item number 6. After that initial documentation and photography, and again, Dr. Blake would take his photographs, then we actually weighed these particular items. Each swatch was individually weighed.
Why'd you do that?
That has not been my practice, but I believe it was Dr. Lee that proposed that from this original cell mark cutting back in July or whenever that was. And so I told Dr. Blake that that's what they wanted to do, that's what we would do. That was
Okay.
fine with me.
Go ahead.
And then I would do the actual cutting, which is to say the sampling of the particular item. And part of that process was to take a pair of forceps and a small pair of scissors, which I had rinsed and actually flamed to make sure they were absolutely clean. And then I would make a cutting of that particular sample. I would also then take the particular cutting that I had made to extract for my purposes, put that into a test tube labeled with the item number, our case number, and then I would show those one by one to Dr. Blake to show that this was in fact the swatch from that particular item number.
And he's snapping away with his camera?
Well, at that point, he's observing. He's carefully observing what I'm doing as far as what sample I'm putting in each tube.
Do you have any idea how many pictures you took of this whole process? This is just one day. I'm talking about the entire case.
Well, I think the stack, it's about a stack about a foot tall, something like that.
Okay.
So it's pretty massive. I don't know the numbers. I think it's several hundred.
Okay, go ahead, keep describing what
Of
you
course-
did.
And of course, some of those are multiple exposures too, so. Then once that, there would also be documentation as to what portion was saved, and Dr. Blake would generally photograph the remainders of what I had saved.
Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit.
And then I would also do a presumptive blood test on those particular samples, just to make sure, and that involves just a minute portion of the actual stain
Now,
material.
why would you do that?
Just to confirm in my mind that there appeared to be blood on those samples.
Even though the people who collected it might have done the same thing at the scene?
Yes, I would just do that on my own.
Why?
It's part of my practice to just know that I have run that particular test, because that's how I test a blood stain.
Okay, it's just a minute amount?
Yes, it's an extremely sensitive test, and so you can do it with just a speck of excuse me, a speck of material.
Okay, keep describing the process of these stains.
Okay. Then the next part of the process would be to seal the remainder in the bindle. So I'd put the remainder back into the bindle, put my seal on the bindle, then put the bindle back into its envelope and seal that envelope up. And so part of the process here is that we're working on items one at a time. In other words, we're not laying out a bunch of these swatches. We're going through these items one at a time as far as the processing. And the purpose of that, of course, is to eliminate the possibility as best as possible of mixing up any of the samples. So in other words, that sample now is all sealed up. The sample is in its tube, and that's put on a separate rack now to be extracted before we move on to the next sample.
Okay, and is it fair to say that these items, when you've described them, which is, this day is simply one date in the life of this case, that all the evidence received from the Los Angeles Police Department was in a sealed condition when you received it?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Some of the larger items were inside sealed boxes, that sort of thing, but yes, they were all sealed.
And your notes for each shipment actually are specific to describing the cartons and the containers within?
Yes, I have very detailed notes on that.
Okay. Keep describing the work you did on the 18th in the company of Dr. Blake, if you would.
Okay. It was clear at this point that these were the two main samples we were going to initially focus on. When I say the two, I mentioned item number 6, which was the Rockingham drop, and then the other item we were interested in was item number 48, a Bundy drop. And intervening there, as far as the cutting process, I next looked at what we call a quality control blood stain. And in our laboratory, every time we do a set of extractions, in this case, we would also run a blood stain that is unknown as to the type to the analyst. So in other words, I'm going to go to a bank of samples that are just coded by number, and I have no idea what those typing results are for those numbers. I take one of those, and in this case it was QC quality control sample number 806. And that sample then gets processed in the same fashion.
Why do you do that?
To us, in our laboratory, it's an important quality control measure because it really tests the analyst each time the analyst does a particular test. And in this particular case, we ran something like about 20 of these different samples because of the large number of extraction sets that we looked at.
So this this is something you know the answer. You know the real type of?
I do not know.
You do not know.
I do not know.
When you follow it through the process, do you look it up?
No, what happens is I go through the whole process, and then at the final stage, when I submit my results for supervisorial review, then the supervisor goes and sees if I got the correct results.
You do okay in this case?
Yes, we did.
Okay. Why don't you keep describing August 18th, if you would?
Okay. So in this case, I took a particular quality control sample and I sampled it in the same fashion as I would one of these swatches, although I didn't do all the documentation as far as photography and that stuff because it wasn't of an evidentiary nature. Then next, the item was 48, and again, we went through the process of opening up the sample, documenting what was on the bindle and the coin envelope, and in this case, it was 113DF CYG 8880. Dr. Blake photoed it, I photoed it. The swatches then were again measured and sampled.
And notes are made describing all these observations and activities?
Yes, and again, it's weighed out. A cutting is taken, it's put into a tube. A presumptive blood test is run again, and then Dr. Blake photoed the remainder. And then that item is then all sealed up. The swatch is sealed in the bindle sealed in the coin envelope.
So in the normal course of the processing, once you do the sampling, it's sealed up and put back in the freezer?
Yes, and it's important to note that what we do is as we process these samples, you don't run into the freezer every 5 minutes. So what you do is during the course of that afternoon or whatever, I'm finishing a sample, putting it aside, finishing another sample, putting it aside, and then when I get to the end of the day, then as a group, they all go into the freezer. 'Cause
Okay.
it's quite cold to work in the freezer.
And then unless you have to go back and get anything out of those packages, that's what's left?
That's exactly right, and it's in a sealed condition, so it's ready to go out the door at any time now if somebody wants to have that evidence back.
Okay, have we missed anything on August 18th that you and Dr. Blake did together?
Well, we also decided at that time that Dr. Blake would be allowed to photograph what other items we had in-house, and this would relate to the Bundy drops at number 47 and number 49 and number 50. And so at that point, we actually got those items out. I did the measurements and the photography was done, but no sampling was conducted at that time.
And is that it for the 18th?
Yes, that takes us to about 8 o'clock in the evening.
And
And,
was Dr. Blake there the whole time?
yes, well, he was there from, I think I mentioned about 1:30 till about 8 in the evening.
And can you give us an idea of how many other days you had like this where Dr. Blake performed the functions that you've just described?
It would be very hard for me to give an estimate. It seems like most of September and October would be my answer to that.
Okay.
But there was a lot of activity in September and October. There were days that were very similar to this. And also there was activity in January, for example.
Okay, now, I think you also mentioned that he would periodically come by and review results and take photographs of those.
Yes, because the process was that we would do this initial documentation with Dr. Blake always present. And then we would, after we'd put together a series of samples, then we would proceed on our own to do the extractions, the evaluation of the DNA that Dr. Cotton talked about. We'd also do the typing phases, and then Dr. Blake would generally come by to review our results. And so some days we would, do the results review and also do this additional sampling. So there's a lot of back and forth with that.
Was Dr. Blake ever present for any of the intermediate steps? Dr. Cotton eloquently described the whole processes for the jury. Was Dr. Blake ever present to view or photograph any of the other intermediate steps in either the RFLP process or PCR process?
Well, I can recall, for example, Dr. Blake was present sometimes at the time that we would do DQ alpha strip readings, for example.
And that's a result,
That's a typing result.
and that's at the end of the line.
Oh, I see what you mean by intermediary. I don't recall those particular instances, no.
Okay. Let's talk, if you will, about specific items. You actually received, instead of, as Cellmark has described through Robin Cotton, obtaining samples, you actually received some entire items to view and process. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. In other words, items of clothing, for example, that sort of thing.
Okay. Did you receive a pair of socks that were found on Mr. Simpson's master bedroom that have been identified as item 13?
Yes,
Where they're found.
Sustain, rephrase the question.
Did you receive a pair of socks which have been described as item 13?
yes.
And when did you receive them, and what else did you receive in conjunction with those socks?
Excuse me. Those socks were received on September 26, 1994.
And would you describe what else you received that was associated or sent along with those socks?
On that particular shipment of evidence?
Yes.
Yes, we also received item number 45, 45, item number 51, item number 84, which consisted of the left and right-hand fingernail samples of Nicole Brown. We also received item number 115, 116, 117, which were associated with the rear gate at the Bundy crime scene.
Okay, let's focus on the package that had 13, the socks in them. Was there
Yes.
anything else that was sent along with those socks?
The socks were inside a sealed letter envelope, and along with those socks were two tubes, plastic tubes with caps that contained cutouts that had information that indicated they were made by Greg Matheson.
And were there numbers on those tubes in any way?
Yes, and I can provide you with that.
Sure.
Yes, there were two tubes and two socks. One tube was labeled 13A GBM, and the other tube was labeled 13A Control GBM.
Okay, and when you, I'm jumping a bit here, when you examined the socks, 13, the two socks, did you notice two holes in the socks?
Yes, I did.
And when you say they were labeled, did you have some sort of communication with Mr. Matheson about those socks that caused you to select the samples to test?
Excuse me. Yes, as I recall, and I can't recall the exact date, but I was aware that he had obtained some conventional serology results that were consistent with Nicole Brown on that particular item.
And when you say that particular item, you mean the cutout labeled 13A GBM?
Yes,
And the control is a substrate control?
yes.
Okay, were you provided or before you received those, had you been provided with any other information about any other possible blood-stained areas on those socks?
No.
Had you been told that there were other areas?
No.
So you had absolutely no information?
Yes, to the best of my recollection, I didn't have any information about that.
Okay, so you had two socks, and there's two holes. Were the holes in the same sock?
Yes,
Okay, so one sock with no holes and one sock with two holes.
yes.
Based on the communication with Mr. Matheson, did he describe the control as being from an unstained area of the sock?
I don't recall him talking about the control, and it was more that I found it when I opened it up, as I recall.
And was it labeled control?
Yes, the tube was labeled control.
So two socks, two tubes, one with a stain, allegedly, one with the substrate control.
That's my understanding, yes.
How did you go about evaluating those socks just based on the two holes and the two tubes? What did you do?
Well, obviously, the initial focus of the examination was in the cutout material because there was already genetic information, genetic typing information developed. So we pursued that particular line. But also, I noticed as I was looking at the socks that there were some other markings on them. And also, I noticed as I spent some time looking at these socks that there were other stains of particular interest.
Well, why don't we start from the beginning? And you first thing, other than the holes that you've described, you noticed some other markings on there?
Yes,
And what were those markings? How did they appear to you?
The markings that I saw, one was what I think was just the size of the sock. It was 10 to 13, like the size of the sock that was imprinted. The socks, each side on the inside of the top, it looked like the initials SB maybe, and also CY were present. There was an arrow pointing to that area where the cutout had been made near the ankle, and that arrow also had a 13A with it in white.
Is that where the hole was?
Yes. And then there was also, near this control, what appeared to be the control area, there was a C, a marking for C.
And there's a hole there, right?
Yes. Then it appeared there was the 13A was marked on the heel of that same sock. And then finally on this same sock, there was an arrow, a white arrow pointing to a stain up near the top.
Did the numbers on the tubes correspond to the holes in the socks? In other words,
I'm sorry.
go ahead. In other words, there was a 13A GBM and there's a white mark with a hole in it.
Yes, this is the, and C standing for control. I mean, that's pretty standard nomenclature in this business. So I was quite confident that that was the control area.
Okay, so you have a tube that has a C on it and a mark with a hole and a C.
Yes,
And then a tube with 13A GBM and a white mark with a hole, 13A GBM,
the hole said, it would appear to say 13A next to the arrow.
13A. Okay. Now, when you noticed those markings, did you notice initially, let's take this very slowly as things unfolded to you, when was the first time you noticed any possible stained areas in the visualization or your examination of these socks?
My attention was called to that other stain I mentioned up towards the top by the arrow. Certainly that caught my eye. And then at that point, after there was some initial photography, and Dr. Blake photoed also, my notes here, this is on page 51 of my notes. Note, saw additional spots of interest on the side with 42A1 stain. Stereo mic, in other words, I'm looking at it now under the stereo microscope, which is a low power magnification, but very effective. These are reddish, about 13 to 15 centimeters from the top. And I have a note that I considered that maybe these were spatter stains or something along those lines.
Okay, let's back up a minute. You see the white marks with the holes, then you see some other marks. Is that correct? White marks.
Yes.
Okay. Could you see any other stain, or strike that? Were you looking with your naked eye at that point?
Excuse me. At that point, I was looking under the stereo microscope, but I was also taking advantage of the illumination that's very bright and oblique provided by that microscope. So you're sort of looking at it with the naked eye under good lighting, and then you're also looking at it under the stereo microscope.
Did you, before you used the microscope, did you just eyeball it first?
Yes, and that's when I noted that other stain up near the top on the side opposite the cutting.
The one that had the mark?
Yes, it just had a little arrow, but no
Okay.
cutting.
Now, let's stay with the eyeball. When your direction was your direction was focused because of the arrow, is that correct?
Yes.
And at that point, before you got the microscope out, could you see any other areas that you thought might be blood-stained with your naked eye?
I don't recall noticing any until we got over to the stereo microscope and set up with the illumination.
And is that the normal course as a forensic scientist, visual examination leading to other more sophisticated exams?
Yes.
Okay. So why don't you take us through that then? You're looking with the stereo microscope. Could you please describe what you saw?
Okay. Under the stereo microscope, I noted that there were some additional stains up towards the top that were on the same side as the sock as where that cutting had been made by Matheson. And I thought that was very interesting.
Okay. Did you then attempt to start identifying those stains or assigning numbers to them?
Now, on that particular night, this is now October 4th, the only numbers that I assigned were that I would call that first stain A1, and it has our DNA number of 42 associated with it, so it's 42A1, but the key is that it's A1. And then on the opposite side, the one that had an arrow pointing to it, I called that one A2. But none of these other ones, I'm sorry, on the other sock, there was also an area that had been outlined, and that was what we called 42B1. So that was on the other sock now.
Okay. And so this completes at least your assigning numbers or identifying stains as of October 4th?
Yes.
Okay. Did you conduct a subsequent examination of those socks?
Yes, I did.
When was that?
Well, the next, I just wanted to review that day also, just to make sure, because part of that was as I mentioned, the photography, but also the individual cutout stain was laid out and documented, because that came in 4 separate little pieces from Matheson's tube. And so that was all documented and measured. And at that point, I actually took 3 of those 4 for my extraction. So I took 3 of the 4 to do my testing with
On October 4th?
on October 4th.
Okay, let's stay on the 4th for just a second. Is this the date that you looked at 13A1 under the stereo microscope?
Yes.
Could you give the jury an idea of what this stereo microscope is? And you mentioned some special lighting, too. Give us an idea of how that helps you look at things.
Yes, it's not like a high-powered microscope. It's more about 10 times to about 40 times magnification. So it's very good. It's much more than a magnifying glass, obviously, but it's not like looking for an individual blood cell or something like that. I mean, it's intermediate there. But it's also very useful to get an idea of where you might see a blood stain and how it stains the fabric. In other words, you can see the reddish area, for example, here against a black background. And so this particular setup that we have has lighting from the sides. That's called oblique lighting, and it's like providing a spotlight on the particular item. It illuminates it brightly. And so that just allows you to see things much more clearly and with the good contrast than you can with just the naked eye.
Tell us what you saw when you looked at 13A, the cutting that Greg Matheson sent you.
Well, on that, excuse me, I looked at those particular cuttings under the stereo microscope exam. I noticed there was reddish staining. Looked like there was some, I noted that it looked like it was through and through. The soaking, it's somewhat powdery on the other side. And that's basically what I saw. In other words, it looked like it was a blood stain to me, but that's just an examination. Okay,
now you mentioned something powdery on the other side. Did you actually dislodge some of those particles?
Well, what happens is the particular pieces start to shed. The fibrils that make up the sock start to shed, and so some of those actually would come off onto the filter paper that we had placed the cuttings on.
And now this stuff is pretty dry at this point, right? The stain?
Oh yes, it's dry.
Yeah. Now, if particles like that or strike that, you needed the stereo microscope to be able to visualize these particles. Is that true?
To see them at that level, yes, but I mean you could see that they were reddish without it. But keep in mind, in this particular sock, you're talking about a dark substance on a dark substrate, and so it's pretty hard to see it without looking at it with some kind of lighting or other.
So if those socks had been sitting on a carpet and dried somewhere, and those, what do you call them, fibrils?
Projection,
Is that what you call them?
Basis,
foundation, compound, inspector.
carpet's irrelevant.
what are they called, fibrils?
Well, the fibrils are associated with the cutting. In other words, once you make the cutting, then the fabric can tend to start to come apart.
Okay. If those little particles had come off a sock wherever it had been deposited, would you need the stereo microscope to see them?
If you had a good pair of eyes, you could probably see them, yeah. You could see them with the eye.
But you'd have to be looking for them?
Yes, unless they're on a white piece of paper, maybe.
Let's move on to the next date that you examined those socks, if you would.
Okay. The next involvement was on October 5th. And with that, there was actually measurements of the, excuse me, the control sample and sampling of the control sample that Matheson had cut out. And at that time, I noted that the measurements that I made for this cutting are very close to the estimate from the previous cutting on the sock. In other words, I looked at those measurements for this piece of cloth, and they were very similar to what I saw for the hole on the sock.
Okay. Keep describing your examination of those socks, if you would.
Okay, again, we're just looking at the control cutout. Under stereo microscope, no reddish staining was seen. I decided to use, since Matheson had made that cutout, I decided to use that as a substrate control because it was in reasonable proximity to the stain area.
Okay, why don't we talk about substrate controls? Is it always possible to obtain one?
No. Some items are, for example, just so heavily blood-stained that it's not practical.
And we'll talk about item number 9, the glove from Rockingham, but is that one where you were not able to,
Yes.
you were not able to get a substrate control?
Yes.
And does that necessarily, the absence of a substrate control, does that undermine or totally doom any results that are produced from any DNA testing?
Sustainer, Fred's question.
What impact on results, DNA typing results, is there if one does not have a substrate control?
Well, with a substrate control showing no types, it gives you confidence that the particular types you're getting on a stain nearby it are from the stain material itself and not associated with the substrate.
Okay, and we'll spend some time with substrate controls probably this afternoon. Why don't you keep describing your examination of the socks on the 5th?
Okay. Again, I looked at that under the stereo microscope. I didn't notice any reddish staining. A presumptive blood test was run on these little fibrils that came off. And again, I'd done that previously for the stained fibrils, and that was a positive test. This one gave a negative test. Resealed the item up. And then it's on October 10th now that we
Okay.
start to do the actual extraction of for the DNA content of that particular sample.
Okay, and by now, have you identified all the stains that you ultimately tested in
No.
this case?
No,
This
again,
is-
we were focused on that sock on this particular blood stain.
Okay, why don't we jump ahead before we go through the processing and describe how you later identified other stains on those socks.
Okay.
What date was that?
We now go to the 25th of October. Yes, page 91.
Mr. Harmon.
Why don't you describe the stains you identified on that later date?
At that particular point, there was some examination of the sock again. No numbers were actually assigned, no additional numbers were assigned at that particular point. That was just an examination of the socks.
Now, why didn't you find these new stains the last time?
The thing that's interesting about these socks is that the more time you spend with them, you really study them under the stereo microscope, you really do see a lot of stains on there. There's a large number of small stains on there, and it's only when you get under the stereo microscope that you can really appreciate how much there is.
So are you telling us that the stains that you identified on this later date, you were not aware of the first time around?
The first time around, I saw that there were some other areas of interest, but I specifically focused on that one that I mentioned. But it was clear that there was a lot to look at on this sock.
Okay. In the course of your examination of these socks, did you have a videotape taken under infrared lighting conditions that demonstrated where stains were that were not apparent to you?
Yes, I did.
What date was that?
The actual videotaping was done on October 27th, 1994, with the assistance of Dusty Clark from the Bureau of Forensic Services Latent Prints section.
Now, at that point, let's stop the clock at that point. If you would you please identify by your lettering or your numbering system the stains that you were able to see before you did the video?
Some of the stains, excuse me, I actually noted, but I didn't assign numbers to until I actually sampled them. In other words, I make drawings and I say, look over here, there's something there, there's something there, there's something there, but I didn't actually assign numbers to them. So sometimes I notice things, and it's only when I go to sample it later that I have to give it a number.
Okay.
It's a somewhat complicated process.
Were you able to see stains in the video that you were not aware of?
I think the answer to that is no. I think most of those stains I had seen without the assistance of the video. The video was just a way to try to capture that information to document it.
Okay.
The contrast is the key there.
Okay, to just go back for a second, you mentioned these presumptive tests that you performed. The negative presumptive test was on the substrate control, is that right?
That's correct.
And positive presumptive tests were on stains that were ultimately tested.
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, could I show People's Exhibits 214A and B on the Elmo? They've previously been marked. They're photos of the socks.
All right, proceed.
Mr. Sims, you recognize those photos?
Should I look at this one?
Yes.
Yes, I sure do. Those are my photographs.
Those are your photos?
Yes, they are.
And are those two separate photos, one of each of the two socks?
Yes, it needs a little focus, I think, on the writing. I can get that a little sharper for my...
Now, did you,
Yes, I can see those now.
you can see them, for record-keeping purposes, did you identify one of those socks as sock A?
Yes,
Is that the one that had the two cutouts?
yes,
And sock B is the other one?
yes.
And 214, which one's on the left, Joe? Okay, the one that just moved there, that would be the 214B. Which sock is that a photo of?
That's sock B.
Okay,
That's the sock that's to the left of the display.
sock to the left, and that's People's Exhibit 214B, and by default, 214A is sock 13A.
Yes.
And is that writing that's in those photos, is that writing that you placed on when you took those pictures?
Yes, it is.
And what does that writing attempt to depict?
It's an attempt to depict the relative locations of the particular stains that we actually sampled in this sock. It's not all the stains, but it's the ones that we typed.
So, and we'll go through that after lunch, these are actually what became stains that you processed for DNA typing in this case?
Yes.
Okay. If you could, I'd like you to think, Mr. Sims, about putting those socks on. I don't mean I'm going to ask you to put them on, but if you put one sock on one foot and one sock on the other foot, I know there's two answers to this. The first way you put them on, where would the stains all be on one side or the other of these socks? And maybe you ought to come out here and demonstrate to the jury what we're talking about. Let me ask you a preliminary question. You can't tell which one of those is the left sock and which one is the right sock, is that right? So let's just assume you put one on your left, either one on your left foot, and either one on your right foot. Then we'll reverse them in a second.
The key point is that the stain that's on the A sock that Matheson cut out is now being compared to those stains marked B1 and B2, which are on this surface of this sock. And the point is that given that the socks go in this direction to the toes, that those stains would either be both on the outside or both on the inside.
Depending on which foot you put the sock on.
That's right.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, I think people in the back row didn't see the demonstration by Mr. Sims. So if you folks want to stand up, you're welcome to do so.
Okay, again, we're talking about that Matheson cutout stain, and we're talking about those stains B1 and B2. And the point is that given the orientation of the sock and where the toe would lie, you would either have those stains both on the outside or both on the inside.
All right, Mr. Harmon, I think at this point we'll take our break for the noon hour. Ladies and gentlemen, please remember all of my admonitions to you. Do not discuss the case amongst yourselves. Do not form any opinions about the case. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you. Do not conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. We'll stand in recess until 1 p.m. and Mr. Sims, you may step down. All right, thank you. We'll be in recess.
Bigger and better things, and you know, I don't want to miss the opportunity to do something you've afforded me the opportunity to do.
What is to be done is really the question.
Mr. Harmon,
I'm sorry, were you?
what are you going to broach with this witness now at this time with regard to
I
the board?
just want him to look at it and identify handwriting and dates that were not on them when he sent those items back to LAPD in October.
This is,
He can testify to what he did when he packaged it up and sent it back to LAPD. What else is there is not really germane at this point. And what is this device that's here on the table here?
which device? I have a feeling this is, Howard, is this the digital camera?
All right, why don't we move that? All right, let's have the jury, please.
Your Honor, how am I going to tell the jury that they had this evidence and consumed part of it in testing?
They'll get that. All he can tell us is he can tell us what he had, what he packaged up and sent back.
Well, can you identify the package and that it's
Yes,
different?
he can identify the package. He can identify what he did.
Can I ask him what he didn't do? Put those other names and dates in?
No. Let's proceed. Stand, please. All right, let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Gary Sims is again on the witness stand undergoing direct examination by Mr. Harmon. Good afternoon, Mr. Sims. Good afternoon, Your Honor. You're reminded, sir, you are still under oath, and Mr. Harmon, you may continue with your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Sims, I think I was a little confused on what a fibril is. I'd like to mark as people's next in order a photograph supplied by Mr. Sims that shows some black cutout material and what I know are fibrils now in the background. May that be
People's 266.
266? And may I put that on the Elmo, Your Honor?
Yes, you've shown it to counsel?
Yes, I have. Mr. Sims, do you recognize People's 266 for identification?
Yes, I do. That's a photograph that I took on October 4th, 1994.
Okay, and we were talking about fibrils. Can you describe where these fibrils are in that white background in the photograph?
Yes. I need a moment on, do I use this device?
Sure, go ahead.
What I'm describing is there's some very fine traces.
Mr. Sims, why don't you try this one?
Okay. Come out?
Yeah. Put it on the podium.
We were talking about fibrils, and what I'm referring to are these little fine pieces of fiber. And as most of you have probably seen from common experience, when you cut a piece of cloth, especially this type of cloth, this weave, some of the little fibrils actually come off from the cloth. So these are the 4 swatches that were present in that tube from Greg Matheson that was submitted along with the SOC. Now, DNA 42 is my number. 13 is the LAPD number. The tube is called 13A, and what I'm talking about when I say fibrils are these little minute pieces that are present, and they come about when you cut the fabric.
Okay, and you also described some minute particles of blood?
Yes, the particles are generally associated with these particular fibrils.
And what causes the particles to come off?
Well, the particles are usually adhering, that's the blood that's adhering to the actual fiber, or fibril,
To the fibrils?
to the fibrils, yes.
And so is it the cutting of the fabric that causes the blood particles to come off?
Sustain. Phrase the question.
What is it that causes the tiny blood particles to come off with the fibrils?
Well, the blood is adhering to the fibrils, and then, of course, some of it also powders itself. So that's the combination of material down in here. And this is on a white piece of filter paper in the laboratory so that you can clearly see it.
And this morning, when you said that should be obvious on a white background, is it the combination of the fibrils with the cut fabric and the blood particles?
Yes, what I'm saying is once you cut this fabric and you then have it on a white background, you can see these particles.
Okay.
And that you really wouldn't see them until you start cutting the fabric.
Okay, you can go back up and resume your seat.
Mr. Harmon, how do you feel the resolution is on the big screen?
Well, I can see it with these glasses on. I'm not sure how the jury can see.
All right. I was going to give you the option to pass the actual photograph through the jury if you wanted to.
Be fine, Your Honor, thank you.
All right. If you'll hand that to juror number one. Since we're looking at very fine particles on the photograph. You return that to Mr. Harmon, please.
Mr. Sims, before the break, we had discussed a little bit this infrared video that you had taken of the SOX 13 to try to identify possible blood stains. Why is it that you resorted to infrared lighting to try to find these stains or identify these stains?
Well, the video was not so much for the finding them. That to me is much better done through the stereo microscope, that type of examination. The point of this was for the documentation of showing exactly where those stains were and using the contrast enhancement from the IR photography.
Okay, we'll show that tape in a moment, but what I'd like you to do is think back to the point where you were visualizing, where you were visually examining the sock, and what I'd like you to explain is how many stains are visible on the video, the infrared video that we'll be marking, that were not apparent to you in your initial visual examination?
There were several.
Okay. Could we have marked as people's next in order, as people's 267 for identification, the infrared video of item 13, the socks, Your Honor?
People's 267.
We've given copies of that to the defense. Can we show that right now? Mr. Sims, I know it's kind of lengthy. Would you stop it at the appropriate time when it depicts enough of what you saw there?
Yes.
Is that okay? May we
All right,
do
how
that?
long is this video, Mr. Harmon?
How long is the part that,
About 15 minutes.
would you like me to sing with it?
Yes.
I would,
Sustained.
I would too. I
That can be sanctioned for it?
would, we agree.
All right,
I'm sorry.
let's see the videotape.
Your Honor, can I point out one thing as we're going to show this videotape?
What is that, Mr.
I
Sims?
just want to point out that this is not a test for blood per se. What we're doing is using it as a contrast.
All right. Mr. Harmon.
Could we start that?
All right, Mr. Sims, you can either look at the small monitor or watch the large monitor. Mrs. Robertson, cut one bank, would you please?
In the upper portion of the video, one can now see one of the stains where there was an arrow. Now we're just sort of moving along. This first part of this is just sort of a run through.
If the witness knows, he identify which of the two socks by number this is?
Yes.
This should be 42, number A, sock A. There's an area down there near my thumb that's of interest.
Mr. Sims, if you see an area that you ultimately identified and tested as a blood stain, could you please point that out to us?
That, yeah, this is the next part. If we stop right here,
Or is this the next?
Mr. Sims, which sock is this?
this is still A, sock
All
A.
right.
So if we stop right here, this is on the side that is actually the same side as which the LAPD cutout was on. This is up near up near the top of the sock, and I did additional testing and on this stain near the top there that I identified as stain A3.
And we actually have photos that show exactly where those stains are that we'll get to in a little while. Is that correct?
Yes, and one can see that there are 3 areas of interest in this particular area. 3
Okay.
stains of interest.
Okay. You want to start? Can we
Yes.
start it again?
Now we can just start to see the LAPD cutout area, their stain.
Can we stop it there, that kind of rectangular area?
Yes, the rectangular area, and you can, excuse me.
Back it up just slightly.
That, can you rewind that just slightly? If you rewind that just slightly, we can show where there. I think right in the middle now, you can see the LAPD cutout. You can see their arrow down at the bottom of the screen there. It looks like 13A is what their arrow is designated with.
Now, it looks like there's a darkened area around the cutout.
Yes, there is still some staining around the periphery of that cutout. You can see that under stereo microscopy.
Even after all of your testing?
Yes, I didn't do any testing other than examining that particular area.
Okay.
And then these are some areas that are not associated as blood stains. They may be some soil deposits, that sort of thing.
Those darkened areas?
Yes. And there's the control by LAPD that we just passed by.
Okay.
And again, now we're moving up to the top of the sock and this, looking at those stains in that area. There's one that's sort of near the top now. It sort of has a teardrop shape going to the left of the screen. That was one that I designated A3.
Now, are we switching over to the other sock now?
No, this is now the same sock. If you stop it right there, it's the opposite side. So this is still sock A, but this is that other stain that LAPD apparently had drawn the arrow to that I mentioned earlier on, and this is stain A2. So this is also up near the top. It's in the same area as this A3 generally, but it's on the opposite side of the sock.
Okay. We start it again?
Yes.
Now, what are we looking at? Is this still?
This is again the LAPD cutout. So this would be the opposite side,
This is still sock A.
still sock A.
And you did not cut any further around the cutout that Greg Matheson made?
That's correct. And again, moving up now, you can see A3 has come into the picture. And there's two other areas associated with that general area there, two other stains, I should say. And that's just telling you that the first minutes of this were all 42A. This is telling you what you just saw as opposed to what you're going to see. So now we're going to move on to the B sock. And it's as you move down into the center of this that you pick up the stain, excuse me, that I called B1. There we can start to see one of the stains in the middle. And then you can see another stain towards the upper left there. Another little stain. And this is an area that has a lot of very small stains associated with it.
About how many?
I'd have to count them, but I think maybe 10 or so, something like that. But I actually have detailed notes about that also. You can see on the, if you go back, can we rewind just a little bit, please? That's good. It's hard to see, but this 42B1 stain had been outlined somewhat by LAPD, and sometimes on this you can pick up the outline. And there's a darkened area down at the bottom. That doesn't look like blood at all. That little dark spot, that's,
Even though it looks pretty dark there?
yes, that's not.
Are those socks black or navy blue?
I described them as black.
Could they be navy blue?
Well, sometimes I grab the wrong ones out of the drawer, but I think they're black. You can see now there's some other little stains showing up in this area. They're just little dark patches. The one that's on the far right now, that's the one that I designated as B2. That's stain B2. So we've got B1 and B2 in this general area. Now we're moving in for a close-up. The one on the upper right there is B1. B2 has now gone out of the picture a little bit. Yeah, there's B2 now, right in the middle. It's sort of a flattened oval right in the middle towards the bottom there. And notice there's some other darkened areas around that. And on these socks, there's a very distinctive logo that I noticed that's in the fabric, and that's seen real well now in the middle. And it gives you a nice reference point for each one of these little areas.
That logo is, Mr. Sims?
I've never seen that brand logo before. That's just my tag right there. Says it's 42B.
Okay, up to this point, have we seen all the stains that are visible on B?
Yes, there's, just briefly, I think there's an examination now of the opposite side of this. Again, there's B2, B1 up on the upper left. This is again that area with B1 and B2. This is at the time we were interested, of course, in this stain. As I mentioned, it turned out to be not a blood stain, but
How did you make that determination?
that examination was done under the stereo microscope, I believe.
Okay. So have we seen everything now on SOC B?
You've probably seen enough. There's a little more maybe on the opposite side of SOC B. If we want to just look at this briefly. The staining in this particular side, on this particular side, is much more subtle than it was on the other side of SOC B.
How many small stains in total were there on SOC B?
On SOC B, we can probably stop the video now if you want. I count about 19, something like that, that I saw. Yes, that's approximately.
Mr. Harmon.
Let's talk about SOC A for a second. Of the stains that you identified and numbered on SOC A, how many of them actually appeared visible from the inside of the sock?
From the inside of the sock,
Did you examine them from the inside at all?
I peeled back a little bit around the top, as I recall, but I never totally reflexed the sock.
So you can't add anything to that?
I don't really think I can add anything to that. Other than, I did photograph, I recall, the area under the LAPD cutout, for example. And I did look around in the areas where I cut. And I made some notes about that.
Okay, well, of the areas that you cut, why don't you describe whether or not the blood soaked through to the other side?
On page 115, this is with regards to the LAPD cutout area, stain A1. I made a note that under the stereo microscope, the area below the other side of the sock, the inner surface shows relatively few specks of reddish brown, sort of what I call powdering, and no indication seen of soaking through to other side. I made a photograph of that. Still some good quantity of staining around margins of 42A1. I made a similar notation with regards to stain 42A2. Now that's on the opposite side, up near the top. This is page 113. Stereo review, cut site, and stereo review means stereo microscope. Still good reddish brown on the edges. Note some powdering on surface below. Consider too if any wicking if wet. Just see reddish brown beads. That's all I say about that.
Certainly. Mr. Simpson, if you'll show Mr. Scheck where in your notes you found that. All right, Mr. Harmon.
Mr. Simpson, maybe I can cut this a little bit short. Was there, let's focus on 13A, where the cutout was from.
Yes.
Was there any corresponding stain on the opposite side of the sock from where the cutout was made from 13A1?
There was nothing that I noted that made it look like it had soaked through to that side, no.
When I mean to the other side of the sock.
Oh, I don't recall seeing anything in that area, no. Certainly nothing that corresponded with that large stain.
Well, do you want to examine when we looked at that video, did it look like there was a stain on the opposite side?
Video speaks for itself.
I'm sorry, your question was?
Imagine the sock A is flat,
Yes.
and the area where 13A1 was cut out from was located.
Yes.
Was there any stain on the opposite side, the opposite wall of the sock, in the same location which corresponds to 13A1?
Now, when you say opposite side, you mean the opposite outer surface?
Right.
Yes, I did not detect anything in that particular area, no.
Okay. Okay, well, we're going to have the photos up in a little bit. Why don't we move on to another item that you examined, the Rockingham glove, LAPD item 9.
Okay.
When was it that you first got that glove?
This is item number 9?
Yes.
Number 9? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That was received on September 7th, 1994.
And when did you begin to process that glove?
The processing of the glove began on October 15th of 1994.
And over how long a period did your examination of that glove take?
Over about a month.
And essentially, were there two major periods of investigation and sampling of that glove?
Yes.
Rather than break them down into separate periods, let's just describe the condition of the glove when it first came into your possession.
Yes. It was in a sealed condition by the It had an LAPD seal on it. It was presented to us when I removed it from the envelope. It was inside out.
Mr. Sims, which page of your notes are you referring to?
I'm on now page 69.
All right, thank you.
It was inside out?
Yes, it was inside out.
Your Honor, may I have marked as people's next in order 4 photographs? May they be 268A and B, which are photographs of the glove inside out?
Yes, 268A and B.
I've already shown them to counsel. And 268C and D of the glove right side out.
All right. C and D.
Mr. Sims, are the photographs that I'm about to show ones that you took yourself?
Yes, they are.
May I put A on the Elmo, Your Honor?
You may.
Mr. Sims, you recognize that as a photograph you took of the inside of the glove from Rockingham, LAPD item number 9?
I recognize that as that. Yes.
Okay, perhaps side by side, may we put 268B, Your Honor?
Yes.
Now, are those both sides of the inside of that glove as it was inside out?
Yes, it is, and you have to remember now, this is inside out. It's a right-hand glove. The easiest thing to note is where the thumb position is, and then also if you look at that little notch on the right side to the lower right, where near the initial CY, that's what I would call the palmar surface.
So the glove, if worn on the right hand, the notch would be by the inside of your wrist,
Yes,
not the back of your hand?
that's correct.
Okay. How did you go about trying to sample this glove when it was presented to you inside out as it was?
Well, I figured since it was inside out, I might as well start with it inside out. The other thing that was interesting was that I thought it would perhaps be easier to sample and get results from this sort of material that's on the inside, this lining surface, rather than the leather that's associated with the outer surface.
Why is that?
Well, in general, leather can cause problems. And also, I figured that if there was any kind of soil or contamination of that sort on the outside, that it would be less likely to have that on the inside.
Okay, when you say leather can cause problems, can you give a little more of an explanation than that?
Yes. Leather as a substrate or a surface on which blood stain is deposited sometimes is a difficult material to work with because it causes problems with the test. Not that it gives you a wrong result, but just that you can't get a result. In other words, you can't get one of these PCR amplifications to occur, or you can't get your restriction enzyme to restrict if you're doing RFLP.
Okay. So what did you see when you began examining the inside of the glove?
I saw a lot of reddish staining all over the inside of the glove.
And did you sample the inside of that glove?
Yes, I did.
And how many areas did you sample the inside of that glove from?
The areas that first of all, I tested several areas using a presumptive blood test. Not all of those areas were actually sampled for additional analysis.
So not all the areas that gave you presumptive positives were sampled for analysis?
That's correct. And what I did is I assigned a number, like a G1, G2, et cetera, to these various stains that I tested in any fashion.
And how many areas from the inside of the glove did you sample for testing?
It's the first examination, it went G1 up to G8. So 8.
Okay, and of all the stains that you sampled, did you ultimately test every one of them?
No.
Why not?
Well, some of them, when we're saying sampling, I mean doing any kind of a test on, such as a presumptive test. The ones that I actually cut out, I did test, yes.
Okay, of the ones that gave the presumptive positive results, why didn't you test them?
I wanted to take what I thought might be a representative sampling. There's still a lot of material on that glove that I never got to, obviously, but
Okay. Now, at some point then, did you turn the glove right side out and examine the outside of the glove?
yes.
Your Honor, may I put 268 C and D on the Elmo at this point?
Yes.
The one,
Go ahead.
the one other point I wanted to make that I believe before we actually turned it inside, or right side out, there were two additional stains, or two additional samples in the notch area that were investigated.
When you say the notch area, is that on the lining or the leather part?
That's on this would be on the lining, I'm sorry, the lining part, yes, when it's still inside out.
When it's still inside out?
Yes,
Okay, and then you turned it right side out
yes,
and sampled the outside?
yes.
Okay, and actually, did you do these examinations and samplings in two different groups?
Yes. Although the first, I mentioned the 8 plus the 2, that's a total of 10 when it's still inside out, and then it's later that it's turned right side out.
Okay, how many samplings did you make of the glove on the outside?
On the outside, there were 4 in this latter set, but one of them was actually still back on the inside, down in that wrist area.
Okay, were you operating under some kind of time constraints at that point?
Not in the latter stages, but in the October 15th and 16th sampling, yes, we were operating under time constraints.
And what was that?
Well, we were looking at a possible cutoff of any testing.
Okay. Was Dr. Blake present during the samplings of these items as he was during the other items you've already described?
Yes, he was.
Took his own photos?
Yes, he did.
No.
I
Proceed.
have an objection to what's
Noted.
later then.
Proceed.
Your Honor, I'm going to be moving to the nail board that has some photos of Nicole on it. Exhibit number 220, I wanted to move on to.
All right.
The one with the nail scrapings and clippings on it.
All right, well, let's move the easel over here.
Sims, you received items 84A and B, LAPD items at some point,
Yes, I did.
and what date was that?
That was on September 26, 1994.
And you gave them, as you have with all of these, your own item numbers?
Yes, I did.
And if you would, I'd like you to take a look at People's Exhibit 220 for identification, specifically the top 5 photos. I'd like you to look at them and see if those are photos that you took during your examination and sampling of these items, the 84A and B.
Yes, I took the fingernail scrapings and clippings photographs. I obviously did not take the crime scene photographs bottom there.
Okay. Why don't we just break them down by right-hand clippings, left-hand clippings, if you would, or perhaps why don't we just start out by listing what you call the right-hand clippings and the right-hand scrapings, and the left-hand clippings and the left-hand scrapings.
Okay. The right-hand clippings, which are actually where the coroner takes these clippings and actually clips off the ends of the nails. That's 45A by my numbering system. And then the right-hand scrapings are 45B. And that's actually where a wooden stick is used to scrape under the nails to collect those deposits, those outer deposits on under the fingernails. And then on the left side, you can see the left-hand fingernail clippings. I designated those as 46A. Again, you can see the cut-off nails. There's actually 6 pieces of fingernail in there. And then the left-hand fingernail scrapings is debris with the wooden stick. That is 46B by my designation.
Okay. Using the LAPD conventional numbers, 84A and B, if you will, did you examine 84A, the clippings?
Yes, I did.
And that's actually your 46.
That's right.
Is that correct?
That's right.
Will you describe what you observed when you opened those sealed packages and examined them?
Okay, now this is for our, it might be easier also if we refer to left and right.
Okay, why don't we do left-hand clippings then?
And this is on page 154 of my notes.
All right, proceed. Thank you, counsel.
The, starting with the left hand, which is actually opposite of the way I started. I'll look at the left here. I noted that on these clippings that there was what I felt was significantly less blood than on the right hand clippings. You can see in the photograph there.
How many, and does the photograph actually depict the nail clippings and fragments thereof that were in that package?
Yes, that photograph does. They're placed, this blue thing, you see, this blue container is what we call a little plastic weigh boat. And so they're put in this weigh boat so that they can be photographed in that manner and documented in that fashion.
Now, there are actually 6 fragments in that little
Yes,
blue
I know
tray.
that the 4 of these are actually nail tips, and then there were just 2 other fragments. I'm not sure. I didn't go back and try to put them all together.
Okay. And I believe you just said you noticed there was less blood in the clippings from the left hand than there was in the right hand.
Yes, I think that's...
Okay. Then we'll talk about the right hand in a second. How about the scrapings?
Okay, on the left-hand fingernail scrapings, I noted that the bindle contained a portion of a wooden stick along with some small particulate debris. You can see small particulate debris, those little dots along that fold of the bindle right there.
And did you actually end up sampling the scrapings, that little particulate debris?
Yes, I did. I later did that actual sampling. The other thing I wanted to point out was that on this left-hand fingernail scrapings, one doesn't see the type of wiping marks that you do see on the right-hand fingernail scrapings. You'll notice the bindle here is fairly clean as far as any wipe marks, whereas there's wipe marks present on the right-hand fingernail scrapings. And I noted that.
Okay. Let's shift to the right hand, if you will. Let's start with the right hand clippings.
Can I make one more comment on that?
Sure, do you have another comment about the left hand?
The left hand, the comment I wanted to make was that I looked at those under the stereo microscope. It looked to me like there were some blood particles and some debris. I noted some whitish pieces that looked like these nails. I don't know much about fingernails, but I think this is a French manicure or something like that.
Now, move to strike this interesting observation.
All right. Curious to disregard Mr. Sims' comments about French
Yes,
manicure.
That's fine, Your Honor. I didn't, I just noted that there were some particles that may have been from this material, this nail-like material.
Okay, let's move over to the right hand, if you would, and let's describe your initial examination of those clippings.
My first observation was that, excuse me, there were 5 fingernail clippings. It looked like there was apparent blood on all 5 of them. And what I did is I placed them in a weigh boat and I numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I could describe what I was doing with them. Again, I noticed these, the whitish tips.
Anything else attract your attention when you examined those clippings?
I noted that there was a possible hair associated with those. It was about 2 centimeters long.
And where was that?
Well, that was just associated with the clippings.
Okay, and anything else with respect to the right hand clippings?
Of particular interest, there was what I thought might be a piece of tissue on the largest nail on the inside surface.
Now,
And-
I'm sorry.
Well,
go ahead.
when I'm looking at this type of evidence, what I'm really keying on is to try to see if there's anything that looks like tissue. Because frequently in this type of case, you see blood. It's not at all unusual to see, if there's that kind of a homicide, it's not unusual to see blood under fingernails. But what I'm really keying on is looking for something that's foreign. And that's why I'd be looking for any sort of tissue.
Why would tissue be of interest?
Tissue would be of interest because if one is scratched by nails, and I've had this done to me by my big sister when I was younger, but you get some of the skin actually reflected off as you scrape it. And so some of this epidermis comes off, and some of the dermis even actually can come off onto the fingernails, and that's where it can get trapped underneath.
And so at one point, you saw something that you thought was tissue on the right hand clippings?
Yes, I just called it possible tissue. I just noted that it was suspicious, and I thought it deserved further attention.
Now, is that, in your examination of either set of clippings, is that the only item, the only particle that you thought might be tissue that you
Yes.
observed?
Yes, that was the only thing that caught my eye.
Okay, and could you point out which nail clipping it was that you thought there might be tissue?
Yes, it was the one designated number 1,
So the upper, actually in
the largest
the largest one at the top.
at the top. Yes.
And what did you do to pursue the possibility that might be tissue?
I removed that particular sample, and I actually extracted it, and I also I did another very simple test, which was just to poke at it, and it turns out to be a sort of a hard material, suggesting to me that it probably wasn't tissue. It was more likely this nail-like substance. But I extracted it as if there might be DNA in there of sufficient or significant quantity, because if it is tissue, it should be loaded with DNA.
So is it well known to you that tissue has significantly more DNA than blood does?
Yes, it does, because the tissue cells are generally nucleated, especially if you get into the dermal layers. That's what you're really looking at. Whereas blood, the DNA comes only from the white cells, which are not the major component of blood.
Okay, and so you determined to your satisfaction that it was not tissue.
Yes, through my testing, I determined that I didn't believe it was tissue.
based on your examination of these clippings as you've described them so far, because you found no tissue, did you observe any evidence that Nicole Brown scratched anyone?
Objection. Close for speculation.
Sustained.
Did you number that possible tissue? Did you assign a sample number to it?
Yes, I did.
What item number was that?
That was 45A-1A.
And then, because at that point you thought there might be tissue there, did you identify some nearby blood that you ultimately tested through this process?
Yes, what I wanted to do was to test some of the blood that was nearby that, very close in proximity. So I took some of that also, and that was designated 45A1B.
As a forensic scientist, what's the significance to you in a homicide like this where blood's under the fingernail to not finding any tissue under any of the nails of the victim?
Objection. Close for speculation.
Well, I would just have to say that if there's no evidence found of that sort of type, of that tissue type, then there's just no evidence of that. I can't say that something didn't happen, but there's no evidence of it.
Okay. Okay, so we've identified 45A1A, these are your numbers, as the possible tissue, and 45A1B as the blood near that possible tissue.
Yes.
Now, what about the right-hand scrapings? Would you please explain to the jury what you noted when you examined the package and contents of the right-hand scrapings?
The right-hand scrapings, I noted that there was this wiping that I mentioned earlier on the bindle.
Would that suggest to you that that material was wet when it was wiped on there?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I looked again under the stereo microscope at this particular area. I didn't find anything that looked like tissue to me at that point. And that was where I left the first part of this examination.
How would you compare, just to your visual examination, the relative amounts of the scraping possible blood particles of the right hand versus the left hand?
Well, there was more of this sort of loose debris in the left hand, but there's more material if you take into account the wipes on the right hand, perhaps.
Now, ultimately, how many samples did you cause to be subjected to the PCR DNA typing process that you'll describe soon? How many of these samples?
Yes, I took a total of 4 samples for extraction. One of these was some of this material. Another one was some of this material.
Okay, you're talking
I'm
about
sorry.
the right-hand
fingernail
scrapings.
scrapings, left-hand fingernail scrapings, the possible tissue from up here, and then the nearby blood from up here. And then after that extraction and evaluation, I actually didn't do anything more with that possible tissue because, in my opinion, it wasn't tissue. So
Okay.
there were 3, I believe, that were pursued.
Okay, and we'll talk about the typing in a little while, but at some point after your typing on these samples was completed, did you send extracted DNA from those 3 samples to Cellmark Diagnostics?
Yes, I did.
Why didn't you test every nail clip?
Well, I didn't think that would be particularly productive. It's a great deal of work to do. That was the main reason. It's still there if anybody wants to test it.
So whatever you did not sample, whatever is visible in those pictures is there for anyone to test in regard to this case?
Yes.
Okay, we're done with that point.
Proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Before we actually describe your testing procedures, I'd like to go over the samples which were in your possession, from which you removed samples for testing, and what remained of those items for anyone, including the defense in this case, to test. Is that okay?
Yes,
Okay, now, this morning we went through 10 items that were never tested for,
Yes.
by you.
that's correct.
And were those all sent back to the Los Angeles Police Department?
Yes,
You didn't sample them?
that's correct. Those, I didn't even open the envelopes.
Now, just to step back from that for a second, whenever you returned items to the Los Angeles Police Department, did you always seal them before you sent them back?
Yes, I did. I did. And in fact, I sealed things at the end of my examinations.
Okay. And then if they were put in a larger package, that would be sealed too?
Yes,
And in that same regard, whenever you sent things to the FBI or to Cellmark, were they always in a sealed condition?
yes.
Okay, but why don't we go through, starting with the lowest numbers, and if you would, describe how much of each item, or if you can, I may need to, if you want, I can direct you to a page number. What's the lowest number that you tested?
Object to this recitation.
Let me see counsel sidebar. Hold on, hold on.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, counsel. Proceed.
What is the total number of items, including substrate controls, that your lab tested in any way?
This would be the number of items that we actually extracted. It's something like 108 samples, including the substrate controls.
Okay. And of rather than go through item by item on what was conserved to speed things up, can you tell us, of those items, how many of those items were actually totally consumed in the testing?
Yes, I can tell you that. I need a moment to count, but I can tell you that fairly quickly.
I think we need to know which ones, not just the number.
And when you give us the number, if you could identify the items too.
The items that, now these are the ones where we consumed the sample. This would be item number 113, which relates to a hair.
Your numbers are LAPD numbers.
These are LAPD numbers. Okay, so that was item number 113, which relates to a hair. Item number 115, I think that's one of the rear gate blood stains. Item number 116, a second rear gate blood stain. I believe that's it. I think even on the glove and the sock, there were still some traces, I know, in those general areas that we sampled. There was one area on the glove that we thought was tissue that was consumed.
Okay. And that proved not to be tissue, is that true?
No, on the glove, it
I'm
indicated
sorry.
to me that it was tissue.
In addition to, these are actually the swatch items or the initial evidence items. In addition to those items, is there also extracted DNA left over from many of these items?
Well, yes, most of these items there is extracted DNA. And for example, when I mentioned 115 and 116, those are those rear gate samples. There's extracted DNA from those left over. I think we mentioned the hair. The hair we haven't talked about earlier, but that work was done by Stephen Myers in our laboratory, and he did not detect any DNA in that extract. So that extract still remains. We didn't do any typing of that sample.
Okay, and as an example of what one can do with extracted DNA, is that what you sent to Cellmark for their analyses on 13A1, the cutting from the sock,
That would be an example of that sort of approach.
and 29, the steering wheel stain?
Yes,
And 84, the 3 nail kit items?
yes.
So is it possible to do additional testing with that extracted DNA if one were to try to confirm results?
Certainly.
And in addition to extracted DNA, is there also something, the jury's heard from Dr. Cotton on these processes, amplified DNA that's as a result of the PCR process after DNA is amplified?
Yes, on almost all of these samples, in fact, there should be amplified DNA left over that is now residing in our PCR product room.
And as a forensic scientist, do you feel that the best check on your analytical reliability is reanalysis of the evidence?
Sustained.
Do you feel that it is possible to validate?
Sustained. Why don't you rephrase the question?
Sure. What could be done with you as a forensic scientist? You've got considerable experience before you worked for DOJ. What could one do with remaining swatch, let's say from the same item?
Object to this whole line.
Overruled.
What could one do with a remaining swatch, some extracted DNA, and some amplified DNA?
Objection.
It's not specific.
Overruled.
Well,
You can answer the question.
let's work backwards. With the amplified DNA, one has the PCR product all ready to go, so one could actually test that. To me, that's probably not the most useful. Then the next approach would be to look at the extracted DNA, and one could take that DNA and either run it through the same types of tests that we ran in our laboratory, or run it in additional genetic marker DNA tests to gain more genetic information about a particular sample. Then one takes a further step back to the actual raw sample, the raw swatch itself, and certainly one can do one's own extraction and work on that material.
And is that just your opinion, or have you relied on the opinions of others in the forensic science field?
Sustain.
Have you relied on any published literature in that area?
Sustain. Let's move on from this area. You've established it's available for other corroboration.
All right, Mr. Sims, we've covered how you sampled and evaluated some but not all of the items. And I'd like you to explain your problem-solving approach. Your lab provides both RFLP and PCR services, is that true?
Yes.
And, for example, when this case was submitted to you with the first batch of stains, what was your initial plan what sort of tests did you want to perform on those stains?
Well, initially, we thought this might be an RFLP case all the way, and our initial involvement in this case was very limited. If you would like, I can go into a little bit of that history.
That's okay. Is that okay, Your Honor? Go ahead.
No, I don't want to hear history. I want to
Oh,
hear
okay.
facts.
Okay.
All right, initial testing plan was RFLP. Apparently
Okay.
that didn't happen.
Yes, initially we were planning to just look at a very few number of samples and to do RFLP testing in this particular case. As it turned out, some of those initial samples turned out to be in a degraded state and not suitable for RFLP analysis. And in particular, that would be the Bundy drops that we looked at in that initial series.
So is it fair to say that RFLP would have been the preferred approach if there was enough DNA and it was intact?
Yes, I think so, because the RFLP test is more discriminating. You have a much better chance of excluding somebody who's not really the source of those samples.
And at what point do these samples actually flow through the same process in the beginning and then branch out depending on how much DNA and how intact it is?
Yes, what we do is we do the initial extraction of the sample, and then we evaluate it to see whether or not we should proceed with the RFLP or the PCR approach.
And do you use the same extraction technique for both methods?
Yes, in our laboratory we do. The